This is honestly a very fascinating documentary. I say this about a lot of documentaries, but this one in particular because, you know, the Armenian Genocide really is the first sort of modern genocide in history. I mean, a lot of us have been led to believe it was the Holocaust, but this movie shows that's not the case.
Right.
I was curious, when was the first time you as a person became aware of the Armenian Genocide?
Yeah, well, I'm a bit of a Holocaust, buff. Like, I guess that's the wrong word. I'm fascinated by the Holocaust to the
Okay.
point where I learned German and lived in Germany and really wanted to understand it. So, as such, I've always been aware of its tentacles to the Armenian genocide. So I've always known about the genocide. What I didn't know as deeply until I made this film was just how deep the denial and the effort to deny and suppress has been. And so for me, Intent to Destroy is partially a film about the genocide, but to me it's more about the, the act of denial, the aftermath of denial, and the mechanism of denial. Which is why, it's the reason that I chose to go behind the scenes of The Promise to make a documentary about the genocide was not just kind of gratuitous behind the scenes. It's because over the years, anytime Hollywood has attempted to make a film about the genocide, they get a call from the State Department that encourages them to shut the movie down. And that to me is just outrageous that we're aiding and abetting in not allowing people to know about this story because of our desire to appease our strategic ally, Turkey. And so when I heard The Promise was being made, I thought that I could add to the dialogue, because there are other documentaries out there that lay out the facts of the genocide. So to me, what made it interesting as a filmmaking opportunity was the fact that The Promise was being made. It would allow me to go behind the scenes and specifically tell the story, not just of the genocide, but the 100 years of kind of suppressing, not kind of suppressing the story. So I've been aware of the genocide. The degree that the campaign to deny it has been so successful, that was not as well known to me, And it's, as you see in the film, it's fascinating that so few people, actually know about this genocide. I mean, I can't tell you how many cocktail party conversations or just in passing when I'm talking to people and what are you working on a film about the Armenian genocide, and just this look glazes over people like, I have no idea what you're talking about, and it's particular, if you know the history, and as you see in the film, it's particularly surprising and alarming that such a massive story could be swept under the rug through the complicity of Western powers. When back in 1915, it was a widely known story. 145 articles in the New York Times about it. Huge relief effort was mounted. In fact, it was called the Near East Relief Fund, but that was the largest relief effort organized as of that date in history to help people in need in another country. Babe Ruth's, I think, 50th home run bat was auctioned off for Near East relief for this Armenian issue. So, well-known story of the genocide back in the day, and equally well known that it was perhaps America's finest hour in terms of raising visibility, raising funds, and that wonderful chapter in U.S. history of actually mounting the biggest relief effort known up until that point. That's been swept under the rug too, because once World War I was over and the Ottoman Empire disintegrated and became the Turkish Republic, all the treaties that allowed the Turkish Republic to kind of go forward eliminated any responsibility for this genocide, eliminated any mention of it. Obviously, the word genocide did not exist back then. The word genocide wasn't created until, the mid-40s. But the fact that we don't know this story and the denial has been so successful, that's what I I didn't know the degree to which that was the case, and that's what I think makes this film a different experience than your typical documentary about historical facts.
Learned a lot about the Holocaust back when I was in the 6th and 7th grade.
Right.
But this subject of the Armenian Genocide was never really covered at all. So it's just amazing to see it wasn't covered, especially in American schools, considering how much of a friend America was to the Armenians following this grace. I mean, it's interesting to learn about Babe Ruth's baseball bat, too.
Yeah.
That was very telling. And it feels like progress has been made to a certain extent, because we have the genocide marches now, and we had The Promise, which on one hand was not a box office success, but the fact that it was made is a victory enough, it seems.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The genesis of The Promise is an interesting part of the story, but even though there's a lot of Hollywood people involved in it, it's not a Hollywood film because it's not a studio film. Still today, I think most Hollywood studios would demur from making a Armenian genocide film because there's kind of a taboo against it. So the fact that The Promise was made was made because Kirk Kerkorian, who's Armenian and a billionaire, he's since passed, set up a fund to make that movie. And there are marches and awareness, but I think still I've been mystified at how few people really, as this film has come out, they're just shocked at the history because it's just something most Americans, most people around the world really don't know about. And the fact that our government does not recognize this genocide, I find, morally unacceptable. I think, as Serge Tankian says in the film, something like a genocide should never be used as political capital when dealing with other countries. And because we want to keep Turkey happy as an ally, our official State Department policy is to not use the word genocide, and I think that's not acceptable.
It isn't. No, I mean, because it's like at this point, there's no denying it happened. I think the information is getting out there more and more as days go by, and yet the fact that the Turkish government won't recognize it or apologize for it or just admit it was a genocide still leaves a gaping wound.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Yeah, I mean, the final, as other people much smarter than I have said, the final stage of genocide is denial. And, it just leaves this unhealing for the families. Like I think the most profound moment in Intent to Destroy is when one of the survivors at the very end of the film says that he lost 11 members of his family to this genocide, and he has to beg people to believe him. And not that you can ever have closure on such a terrible tragedy, but people should have a sense of justice and of recognition. I think that's part of the healing process.
It is. It absolutely is. The film you brought up, that The Promise was not a Hollywood production. And that's probably why it got made so easily. Yeah.
I mean, The Promise had a number of Hollywood people involved in it. Mike Medavoy as a producer, Ralph Winter as a producer, Oscar Isaac, Christian Bale, but it did not come from a studio. It didn't come from the studio system. And I find it problematic that, certain subjects are off limits. It'd be like pulling Steven Spielberg aside and whispering in his ear, "Hey, don't make that Schindler's List because we need the Germans as our friends."
Right.
So, and that's the Armenian people deserve their Schindler's List.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the Germans these days are more than willing to admit the Holocaust happened.
Yeah.
Okay, Michael Moore sort of covered it in what country where to invade next. So, and it's sort of like it would be nice if Turkey did the same thing. And
Yeah.
in regards to doing like the behind the scenes stuff on The Promise, how much freedom did Terry George give you? It seemed like he gave you quite a bit.
Yeah, I was surprised at where I could stick the camera. He was, at first I had to earn the trust, and I would say the first third of the movie I kind of hung back, and but Terry was terrific. He was very supportive of my mission as long as I didn't get in the way. I did kind of feel like I couldn't. I certainly didn't want to get in the way of their movie making process. But at a certain point, I felt like there was enough trust that I could start taking some risks. And in particular, it was when they were shooting the massacre scene that I felt, well, first of all, I knew it was the emotional center of their film, and I felt it would be, therefore, potentially could be the emotional center of my documentary. So that's where I started, being a little more proactive. I saw Christian, rehearsing with a child who was supposed to play dead, and I just kind of moved in and started to invade his space a little bit, and that was the first time on the movie that I actually did that, and he was cool with it. And after the scene was over, I saw the actors were visibly moved by the recreation or how Terry shot that massacre scene, and I just felt I had to talk to them even though they were still shooting, and I kind of moved in and talked to some of the actors, and I think it produced a really some really emotional material, and that was kind of the point where I felt like the crew has accepted me and the filmmaking team has accepted me as somebody who's part of this mission to tell this story. And so from that point on, I had tremendous freedom to just put the camera where I needed to put it.
That's good. That's a good feeling to have.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, Shore is, I can't pronounce it. Shore, thank you. Her reaction is to what she says about this still keeps happening. It's priceless because it's so true.
Yeah.
And
that was an important thing.
Yeah.
I think it's not just a film about some historical event that happened in 1915. The denial of history, the sweeping of facts under the rugs. I think this is a very important lesson for today. First of all, we're never going to have peace in the Middle East until we understand the history and how we got to where we have gotten to. And secondly, I think this movie is a parable for our times, with the alternative facts and fake news and, this current mindset that if you say it enough, it becomes reality, I think we all need to be on guard about that and vigilant, obviously. And I think this film kind of underscores that. So it brings the history right up to the present.
It does, yeah. And we absolutely do need to learn from history. I mean, looking at this and looking at the evidence you managed to get of the Armenian Genocide, which is very telling, and it's almost like Hitler ripped off the genocide for the Holocaust. It's like, just do what they did. And
Right.
It kind of makes more sense as to why he was kicked out of art school, maybe. But anyway, that was going through my mind because it's just like you look at the Armenian Genocide, you look at the Holocaust, they're almost like they're the same thing.
Well, it is said that, Germany learned a lot of lessons about how to move people via trains. I think the big lesson that Hitler took was that because by 1923 the genocide had been swept under the rug, by the time Hitler was invading Poland, he famously said to his generals, who today speaks of the Armenians? And basically he was exhorting his generals as they go into Poland to show no mercy, because Hitler's lesson of history in the Armenian example is that, the victors write history, and, nobody seems to care that an entire population was wiped out because it was in the interest of the victors to sweep that story under the rug. And that is the dangerous lesson that Hitler was drawing from the Armenian Genocide.
Yeah, and this is, it's one of the main reasons why, we have instances of history repeating itself. This is like one of the first in like modern times.
Yeah.
And how difficult was this to research? Because with governments trying to keep a lid on it, I imagine getting evidence or showing still photos of that time must have been hard. Was it hard, or?
I had a great team of researchers and a great archivist who dug up some stuff. A lot of this, the reality is putting the film together and telling a cogent story and taking complex history and presenting it in a way that's digestible. That was the hard task. The evidence is out there. That evidence was not hard to. That's, to me, the crazy part of this. This was 145 New York Times articles back in the day when this actually happened in 1915. There is documentation. it wasn't like I had to go on some secret stealth mission to uncover evidence, documentary evidence. That's what's so stunning about this. It was well known when it was happening. It's this 100 years of changing the narrative. It's why the tagline of the movie is "Whoever controls the narrative controls the history." Because this is an amazing example of how a well-known story of a moral issue gets swept under the rug through the repeating telling of a different narrative. And that's the dangerous times we also live in now.
It is, yeah. Because there are times I wonder, if the truth matters. It seems to be more about their narrative, who controls the narrative, and which narrative people choose to follow, whether it's truthful or not.
Exactly. It's like there was a cover in Time magazine about 4 or 5 months ago. Is truth dead? And I think it's a very serious issue.
It is. It's a very serious issue. And how would you say the documentary evolved from you from when you started shooting it to when you began editing it?
In my original mind's eye of the film, I actually thought the promise was going to play a much larger role, because that was the visual eye candy. But the last thing I wanted was this film to be perceived as a promotional film for another film.
Right.
It's why we delayed the release of this film until after it came out. I think the promise plays a role in my storytelling, but I didn't want it to be the focus. But somehow, when I first started the project, I envisioned less history and more promise. And I think the inverse has happened for the final film, and I think that's the right balance. The promise is an important part of the story, but not the blow-by-blow of why this film and how it was made. That, to me, is not that interesting. What is interesting is how denial works, how denial has worked in particular in this story, and what are the basic facts of the genocide, so that people can have an understanding of this historical period.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, because denial is still a big thing, and it's. I think it's great you had access to the promise because, again, the fact that it got made at all by anybody is a miracle.
Yeah, exactly. The reason that I wanted to focus on the promise was not so much to tell the story of how that film was made, but rather to show that, it gave me that vehicle to show how every other attempt to make a movie like this has been shut down. And that's the importance, its connection to the suppression of history.
Absolutely.